What is it we do when we work, rest, play? These things that take up so much of our lives. But what if there's a different question? Not about what we are doing, but rather, what are we looking for when we work, rest, play? Are we hoping that what we do, how we relax, or the hobbies we choose will somehow bring us the identity, purpose, and meaning we've been searching for? Are the true religions of our time work, rest, play?
Well, good evening. It is great to have you out and with us. We are here for a seminar on our Work, Rest, and Play series. What we were sort of trying to do in the kind of teaching process of that series was essentially, I suppose, just to stir up some thoughts and create some ideas about this sort of whole notion of work. It struck me particularly, in Calgary, how much we're a city that essentially exists to work. If I sort of understand the history of Calgary, it's work that brought everybody here, and that's kind of why this city boomed and why all this sort of thing's going on. And then, of course, even if you're not in Calgary, work's such a central part to so many people's lives. And that sense of, not work simply in terms of how do I earn my money, but work in the terms of what is it I'm here to do, and then how do I balance that in a healthy life. So it felt to me that it was important at the end of a sort of Sunday morning teaching series and that to just create a little bit of space for a different type of conversation relating to that. And one of the things, if you've been to a seminar with me before, one of the things I love about Westside is that there's just so many awesome people in this church that have expertise in all sorts of areas. And no matter what sort of subject it is we teach, somebody pops up and sort of says, hey, do you know what? I kind of do that for a living, or I happen to have a PhD in that particular area that you're talking about. And it's great for the nerves as a preacher that, just at the end of a sermon, somebody comes up and goes, I'm an expert in the thing that you were just talking about this morning, which you're not an expert in. And, and you think, oh my goodness, what's this person going to say? What I've done this evening is assembled a stellar cast of friends with us. So this is Gail Kastning, and this is Randy Poon. And I suppose I'm going to let you guys introduce yourselves, if that's okay, because I have had a few conversations with both of you in various contexts, and say hi in church and stuff like that. But both of you sort of work in areas that relate to the conversation of what we do with our lives. So Gail, you are would you sort of, I was nervous that I get people's terms right. Would you say you were a kind of career coach? Would that be the sort of term you'd use, or consultant, or how would that work?
That's all under revision right now in the career development industry. I have a career services business, so I coach, facilitate, and I consult I support job seekers, career changers, and organizations who are doing initiatives to get people back to work. So that's my business.
Right.
Yeah.
Fantastic. And so your business your website is purposefulcareers.ca, yeah?
Yes.
So just spell it exactly as it sounds.
Purposeful Careers.
Yeah, so you can check that out in your own time. Mm-hmm. And then Randy.
I am the head of the business program at Ambrose University. I'm a professor. I have a PhD in leadership, and I teach in a wide variety of areas, including leadership, of course, marketing, corporate social responsibility, data analytics, business intelligence, and whatever I can't find a professor for. Typically, I'll try to teach myself sometimes.
And both of you come to Westside, so for me, it's always a real privilege to sit and have conversation in this level of kind of expertise with people that are part of our community. So thanks so much for taking the time to be with us. So I almost want to ask right at the start, the sort of question is, so what draws you into that type of job? So as a pastor, people never ask you why you chose to be a pastor, right? Because they basically assume they know the answer. It's because nobody would do this unless God told them to. It's the sort of impression you get from people that it must be the call because it seems like a terrible job. Now, I've never been, in sort of career consultancy and stuff like that. I have spent a little bit of time working in a sort of academic context. But in terms of you personally, what was it that drew you to do this with your life? Or was it accidental? Sometimes we do end up in...
Question. Do you want to start?
Sure, I'll start
Okay.
this time. One of the things I'll be talking about a bit later on is this whole idea of vocation, but in many ways, the work that I'm doing is a culmination of so many different experiences that God's given me over my life. In many of you, how many of you are in only one job? It's been a variety of careers that we've been in. We kind of create this patchwork of careers, and we end up where we are, basically. I've been involved in industry. I've been involved in government. I've had my own consulting practice. I've worked in the nonprofit sector, working in Christian ministry. I've led young adults ministry as well and working with churches. I've pastored a church as well, too. And now I'm teaching at a university. And I think in many ways, what I'm doing right now in terms of being a professor and working with young adults, essentially, is really kind of this wonderful blend of all these experiences, gifts, and skills that, again, God has provided. And really, I have this passion for teaching. I have this passion for coming alongside of people. And in this case here, it's almost like being involved in youth ministry again, but doing so from an academic perspective, but still guiding them along the way. And more specifically, really say, okay, how do we use this vehicle of business in a way that's responsible, in a way that connects to stewardship, in a way that connects to serving society, basically. So that's kind of where I arrived, where I am today.
It's funny because I used to actually say that when I was involved in, so I taught New Testament at a seminary, but people used to say to me, what's it like? And I actually, funnily enough, I used to say the same thing as you. It's not that dissimilar to being a youth pastor sometimes, just with exams. But I really appreciate that sort of way of thinking about it. And I also, it strikes me, and I'm just throwing these ideas out, maybe we can pick up on these later, the way you said that I think a lot of us would experience is that sense of the changing career that happens nowadays. And I sometimes wonder, and perhaps this is something we circle back to in one of your talks over the evening, there was a period of time where it was sort of, you would ask some teenager, hey, so what are you going to do when you finish school? And I hear that question asked from time to time still of people, hey, so what are you going to do? But it feels to me like quite an archaic question now, because it seems from what I'm seeing, and you guys would know better than I would, that the expectation is that most people, of course, the course of their life will actually do several different things, and therefore what you do straight out of school might not be what you're doing, whereas there was a period where you kind of had to choose your career really carefully because that was going to be you, for your career. So it's interesting that to see that almost work out in society, and does that change how we think about work at some sort of level, So Gail, how did you end up doing what you do?
Well, I am right up with the statistics, which is 3 to 4 career changes in somebody's lifetime. So that's what the stats are right now. And I used to be a server. That was my first job. I call it a job. I had no intention of turning it into a career direction, although some people do. And I went into office admin after, so I was retrained and went into office administration. And then from there, I was a legal office administrator and realized that was a really poor fit because I had to sit behind a desk and type out wills and estates, and I am a hands-on mover. I need to move in my occupation, so that did not fit me really well. So I decided I was going to change out of that, and I went back to school with a lot of trepidation, and I became a teacher. So I taught for 15 years in Saskatchewan, and then I went overseas and I taught in Japan. And when I was in Japan, I realized that people work differently, and I traveled extensively, and I started to think that, why do people choose to do the careers that they do, and why do they get up in the morning and go to work? And the Japanese have a very different idea about work. They have something called ikigai, and ikigai means that you get up in the morning with a purpose and with motivation. So you get up with a reason to get up. And living in Japan, when you see people do very menial tasks with such care and consideration, you start to think about your own culture and how we work and the difference between cultures. And so while I was in Japan, I started thinking heavily about the career development industry, and that's when the seed was kind of planted. And I thought, when I moved back to Canada, I would maybe want to get into that industry, but I had no plan. And so I arrived here from Japan in 2002. I came to Calgary and I didn't know anybody. And I restarted a career here in international education. And through part of brokering students and bringing them to Canada to study English at a Christian high school in town, I realized that I could also help these students plan their career. And because I understood them, most of them are from Asia, I understood that their parents chose their careers for them at birth. And I knew that other people who would work with them as a career coach would not understand that and would be telling them to go out and find their passion and live their dream, and that was not going to work for them. And so I indirectly became their career advisor because I understood them culturally, because I was an intercultural trainer and an international student coordinator at that time. So I got a taste then of working with high school students in career development, and from there I quit my teaching job and went full force into the career development industry. And I initially worked with people who were coming to Canada in 2006. They were all newcomers. I got a contract working in a newcomer bridging program, and I was training people to fit into the Canadian work culture. And they were geoscientists, they were engineers, they were folks that were coming from all over the world to work in Canada, and in particular in Calgary. And so I spent 10 weeks training them for the Canadian workplace and trying to get them to sort of switch from their cultural way of working into moving into Canadian culture and the workplace in Calgary.
So it's interesting, you were saying this Japanese concept of ikigai.
Ikigai.
And I was just reading actually a couple of months ago Rob Bell's book, How to Be Here, and he actually spends the first sort of 4 chapters talking about this concept. And this idea of what it is that gets you up in the morning, what it is that drives you, and that sense of figuring out, like, what am I here for?
Yeah.
And some of the sort of strange notions that we then get as a result of, once we feel like we've figured out what we're here for, then trying to figure out how to make that happen seems to be. But maybe that's something you want to talk about later. But just picking up on this sort of conversation we've had, so you said you had a job as a surfer, and it wasn't a career. So when we're talking about work, I suppose almost the question is, what are we talking about when we talk about work? There's jobs, there's work, and there's careers, and then there's vocations. So like, I almost wanted to phrase the question like this, if somebody from some culture in the distant past, like, I'm a Bible scholar, so everybody that I study died thousands of years ago, but I sometimes find myself thinking, what would they think? Like, if a Roman marketplace tender turned up in Calgary, would they recognize anything we do as work? And how do we think about work related to how, are we sometimes looking for purpose and ideas in work that maybe in times gone by they didn't? So, in that sense, and I'll let you decide who wants to answer the question first, but I'd love to hear both your perspectives. Like, what are you talking about when you talk about work? How would you define vocation and career or job? Like, what are the things that you look out for that you think are important? I'll let you decide.
Good question.
Who wants to answer that first?
Okay. That's a long answer, but I'm going to make it short. If we look at the definition of work, work is drudgery. That's actually the definition of it.
Right, okay.
If we and I would say that a lot of people in this culture see work as drudgery. The other one is
Sort of vocation?
well, career, right?
Or career, sorry,
career.
yeah.
So we see career as a ladder to climb. That's
Okay.
kind of the cultural, I would say the cultural analogy that we would use would be it's something to climb, and then vocation tends to be saved for people who have a religion. I think that secular culture, and I work very much so in secular culture, in addition, to having Christian clients too, but I think it's very compartmentalized and very separated. However, I don't think that that's how Jesus worked. I think the idea is that when I look at my work, I see it all as one. And even though I use the word job, that's because people tend to see their very first high school experience in work as a job. They don't see it as a career yet, and so I saw it as a job. So I think that folks in this particular culture, we have compartmentalized our work into different pieces, and I'm not sure that that's exactly what God had intended for us. I think that our work is our purpose, and our purpose is our work. And so separating them and compartmentalizing them, I think it's part of how in secular culture we do see it that way.
Yeah, and I suppose, the idea of vocation does speak into the notion of calling, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Which I suppose, is that you're absolutely right, is to say that it suggests that there's something other is drawing you towards that particular thing to do. So, what would your weigh in on that be, Randy? Because you would obviously, you work in terms of as a prof of business, but then also, all of your students are probably, my experience of working with students is they're always 1, 2, or 3 years away from trying to decide, what am I going to actually do? So you'll see it from a variety of perspectives, I would assume.
I think one of the key parts here is this whole issue of identity. If we, think of how we greet each other, right? When we say, we see someone we don't know, we say, oftentimes, what's your name, that kind of thing, and we go, what do you do? And so we identify ourselves by our work.
I feel really bad because that's what I said to you guys this evening. Tell us what you do.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of the challenge. I think when you look at the area of vocation and this idea of calling, it goes beyond simply what we do for a job, what we do as an occupation or for a living. Yeah. And it's interesting, I teach leadership, and there's a number of different theories that are out there, and people who've worked with businesses and whatnot, and one of them is called the spiritual leadership theory, developed by a fellow named Jody Fry, and he's done some consulting work. He's worked in Montreal. He's from Texas, but he's done some work in a food processing facility in Montreal. And one of the parts of his theory is this idea of calling and membership, that when you have a strong sense of calling, so this is a secular company, when you have a strong sense of calling and a strong degree of membership, it's going to result in a stronger workforce, and a workforce that is greater committed to the organization. People are going to be better satisfied. And I think that's a part that sometimes we're afraid of. We're afraid of this whole area of that calling won't align with the job. And yet I think companies, though, can succeed better if they really look to find out what are people, what's their gifting in the first place? What are they called to in the first place? And I think you'll find that employees will work harder, they'll work better if their calling aligns with the work they're doing. I'm not saying that vocation always ties into your job necessarily. It has to be a one-on-one fit, though. But I think if you deal with that whole area of calling, you'll find that you'll get a greater degree of commitment from your employees. Now, from an individual perspective, I think the whole notion of vocation and calling is looking at who you are and who you are, period. How God has created you to be. What are the gifts and skills and experiences that He's given us? Yeah. Both of us have had varied experiences that have brought us to where we are today in our different fields. And I think that's what vocation's all about. It's that ongoing search for who you are, who God has created you to be, what's gifts and skills He's given you, and to continue to be open to what He's going to have for us down the road. I don't think I would have ever thought that I've been teaching university and a professor back in my 30s. Yeah. I started my PhD in my 40s and still didn't think I was going to be a professor. Yeah. And it wasn't until I hit 50. And I'm from Calgary, was living in Ottawa, working in government, and we came back to a function at Ambrose University in 2010, never heard of the school in the first place, and discovered they had a business program, and all of a sudden, the wheels in my mind get going there. And my wife, who's here, could tell you, the wheels in his head are going again. And it was like God was placing in my heart the desire to actually be a professor and to teach at a Christian university. And that only emerged when I was 50 years old. So.
Well, and I think we overcomplicate this. I quite frankly do, because I look to Jesus as kind of the model of how we should work in this world, and he just went out there and met needs. Like just simply going out and meeting needs. And when I'm talking to my folks who are my clients who are looking for work, I simply say, quite frankly, if you get out there and you start networking and you start talking to people and you start to talk to employers and you try to figure out how can you be of service with the skills that you have and the knowledge that you have and the gift and like you said, the giftings that you have, and you look for their needs and you have conversations with them about, what are some of the problems that you currently have right now, and what are some of the needs that your organization currently has, and then you meet those needs with the skills and the giftings that you have. Like it really is that simple. Yeah. And that's kind of what Christ did, is he just sort of went out into the world and he tried to figure out what the needs were, and he made himself available. He didn't sit at home and watch Netflix. Because he didn't have Netflix, but he,
But he probably wouldn't.
But I don't think he would have done that anyway. So it's getting out there and actually finding out, what are the gaps in the culture right now? What are some of the issues that are going on in Calgary right now? Yeah. And where there's problems, there's a job description. A job description simply is problems in disguised. They're disguised as a job description, because if an employer didn't have problems, they wouldn't have a job for you. So. I really think that we kind of overcomplicate this whole area of work, and we've got it all separated. And when you're working, there's times that we're not going to like what we do. It's just that simple. I don't know about Christ because I can't interview him, but I'm pretty sure that there was days when he was wondering, what am I doing? Why am I doing what I'm doing? And the other dynamic side to this too is that it's difficult. It's not always going to be fun. And getting out there and meeting needs and helping people and being of service in our community through the work that we do, whether it's paid or unpaid work, because that's the other thing, is we compartmentalize with paid and unpaid work. And quite frankly, there's a lot of unpaid work out there that we can be doing. And I mean, it would be great to get paid. And sometimes we need to get paid because we have to pay our bills. But there's just so much work out there that has to get done. And it doesn't seem to matter if we're in a bad economy or a good economy. There's work.
Yeah. It's interesting, actually, because I would say, even if I think autobiographically, that was quite a kind of seismic moment for me in my life, where I feel like one of the most privileged people in the world, because I actually get to do and be paid for what I think I was called to do, right? But I've had periods in my life where those things don't all line up. And I remember a moment in my life where I realized, I would do this even if I didn't get paid for it. I would just figure out a way to do it in my spare time, Right. And that was quite important for me. I think, as you're talking there's a couple of things come to mind, and I'm curious of your feedback. I remember somebody once talking about Nehemiah, right? And so Nehemiah is this guy. He's got he's got a dead-end job. He quite literally has a dead-end job. His job is to taste the king's wine to find out whether it's poisoned or not. like that is the definition of dead-end job, right? And then he gets, because he's in exile, he gets bugged by the fact there's no wall around Jerusalem, right? So he goes to the king and he leverages his position to basically get this king to fund this project to go and rebuild the wall of Jerusalem. And I remember hearing somebody say once, and I found it really helpful. They just said, your complaint is your call, right? So, which was something like you just resonated with when you talked about need. So, like, if you can see the need and are finding yourself going, somebody should do something about that, you're probably beginning to scratch in the area of your call, because everybody else is passing that thing and they're not doing anything about it. But for some reason, the fact that it's irritating you is probably, how does that, do you think that's, you're welcome to say that's a really bad sermon, David.
No, that's absolutely right. And that's either a job or it's an entrepreneurial venture.
Yeah.
It's one or the other.
Yeah.
Because problems and pain points are either a job or they're an entrepreneurial venture.
Yeah.
And so when we're looking for work or looking for an entrepreneurial venture too, because I coach people in starting up entrepreneurial ideas, it's the same thing. You're meeting a need. And so scratching something, I like that idea.
Perceiving a problem.
I think the other aspect too, related to what you're saying there, Gail, is the whole aspect of even your rest and play aspects. Okay, we've been talking about work, rest, and play, and I think this whole idea of vocation goes beyond simply just the work side. Obviously, it deals with all of our lives, and I think when those needs that you see, those problems that you described there, can also be ways that we can also serve within the church. And it kind of goes back to what Bobby was saying a couple of weeks ago about this whole notion of we have local serve. I'm on the local serve committee, and in some ways the reason why I decided to join with the local serve committee, working with Adam and then now with Chantel, is because it aligned with part of that calling, that whole need to say, okay, how do we in the church, how do businesses address social needs? How do we deal with issues of social justice? And so I think those are kind of the things that we can take a look at. What are the things that God has placed on your heart, and how can you resolve them, not only in a work environment, in a career environment, but also through your rest and play, through your church involvement, through your community involvement, or any of these other vehicles in which you can serve.
I was thinking as well when you were talking about it there, and I was trying to. I have these ideas when people are talking, thinking, well, that reminds me of this, and that reminds me of that. And then I have this kind of nervousness comes over of, can I remember the reference properly? When you were talking as well, this sense of this calling question, I was reminded there's a book, and it's not a very new book now, by Stephen Pattison. I don't know if you've encountered it, called The Faith of the Managers. Have you bumped into it? He talks about how management becomes religion. And what Pattison says, which is really quite fascinating, is he's kind of got a foot in both camps, and he's watching the secular world and he's watching the church, right? And he says, actually, and it just resonated, when you were talking earlier about the sense of vocation and calling, he was saying that actually what we're beginning to see secular companies do is borrow these structures and ideas from the church, because actually they're realizing there's something quite profound going on when you start to deal with the way a person thinks and identifies and feels value in the kind of context they're in. But Pattison then says, because in his career he's been around long enough to watch the church start to borrow business ideas from the secular industry. But Pattison says what's quite fascinating is they're borrowing these ideas that were originally their ideas that have just been secularized, and now they're borrowing them back. But that sense of, what am I here to do? And therefore, how does that leak into the sort of sense of not just what my working life looks like, but what does my play life look like? And so the text that I mentioned, I've got it on the screen here. It's a famous text, but I wanted to just come back to it. This Colossians 3, and I think it links into what you're saying. Whatever you do. So there's a holistic sense to that, right? Of this sense of whatever you do, work out with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for human masters, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It's the Lord Christ you are serving. Now, I think, I find this a fascinating piece of text, and one of the things I find really fascinating about it, and this is the kind of background piece for me, is that most of their English translations actually, they help us a little bit with this text in the way they translate it to keep a piece of clarity. But Paul does something quite interesting in this word, that the word Lord and the word master are actually the same word in Greek. There's no, so you actually, in Paul's original form of this, there's a really interesting wordplay where Paul says, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as working for the Lord, not a Lord, he says. And he kind of leaves you to kind of figure out who he's talking about. There's almost a sense of that you might be working for a master, but can you adjust your mindset so that what you do for a master is actually for the master, And so I'm curious, so I could read this verse all day and think about it as a Pauline scholar, but in terms of, because it speaks to what we do, and when I hear this, I think Paul looks like he's almost trying to take a job and turn it into a vocation, right? So you might be in a job, right? And in this case, like, you're actually a slave, right? So you're in a job you don't want, right? But there's a way to change your perspective. At least this is how I read it. There's a way to change your perspective on your job that starts to find calling in it. I don't. Maybe this isn't an important verse for you guys, and that's okay. But I'm curious as to how you would read something like this in your roles.
Sure. Well, one of the things that I focus on in terms of leadership is this whole area of personal interaction. And in being a leadership scholar, I get to work with these university students. And what we've decided to do is to, in some ways, partway through their career, partway through the university time, I have a course called Leadership Theory and Practice. And there was a particular book that we went through. It was called Leadership and Self-Deception. I'm not sure if any of you have read it or not, but it's a very powerful book. And I was typically dealing with that book in my fourth year students. And they'd say, well, this is a really meaningful book. You should have talked about this a whole lot earlier. And I decided to implement it in the middle of my second year class instead. And really what this whole concept deals with is this idea of how do you connect with people? How do you relate to people in the place where you're working, resting, or playing? And it really focuses on the whole concept of treating people as people. I know it sounds kind of really bizarre. It's like, well, of course, why not? But I think in many ways, though, when we get so involved in our careers and so involved in our pursuits, our goals and objectives become almost primary. And as a result, then, we begin to see people as objects. And the authors of the book, Leadership and Self-Deception, basically call that being in the box.
Right, okay.
And when we're in the box, what happens then is that we put our needs, our goals, our objectives as being primary over anybody else's. And as a result, then I see any of my colleagues, whether whoever is around me, it's what can you do to help me achieve my goals and objectives. And one of the things that I try to convey to the students, and it's really quite revelatory because it's so easy to get caught up thinking, well, I'm a good person, I'm concerned for the other person. But imagine this, imagine a young father or a young mother basically trying to establish their careers, okay? And they're both working very hard, and they put in night after night of hard work basically, not necessarily to try to climb the corporate ladder, but basically to provide for their family. It's not easy to establish a successful business or to make oneself known amongst one's peers, basically. And so basically it involves sacrifice. Now, part of the challenge, though, that comes into play, though, is that if that becomes our primary goal, though, then what happens then? Okay, let's say this young couple now, they have a child, okay? I'm not saying who's at home the longest amount of time. Mom might be there first, dad might be there afterwards kind of thing. But they're exhausted. One's exhausted because of the hard work that they've been putting into work. The other's now stopped maybe working, and they're spending most of the time with the child right now. They're both tired. But the working parent essentially comes home, has been working on a project, wants basically to be able to kind of rest, get to sleep, kind of thing, and all of a sudden in the middle of the night, the baby starts crying. Now, for those of you who are young parents who were there before, or you might have grandchildren, that kind of thing, it's like, how many of you ever turned over and go, okay, if I show that I'm awake, then I'm the one that has to get up and tend to the baby. And so what you do then is you just kind of pretend you're asleep. And so the other person gets up, kind of thing. And part of it is that, why did you do that? In part, is it like you basically, in essence, you worked hard, but you did that because you put your needs above I'm more important, basically. I need my sleep. I've got a project to do. I've got a presentation to do in the morning, for example, and I need my sleep. And so what we do in that case then is we see ourselves then basically, when we're in the box, as the authors describe, we see ourselves as being more important, being hardworking, and being fair. And how do we see our spouse, let's say, if they complain about it? Well, you're insensitive, you don't understand the situation, that kind of thing, and we portray them in a different way, and we see them in a different light. And that's the whole concept, basically, of being in the box. And so one of the things that I talk to our students about is, where are you at in that? Where are you at in that process? Imagine yourself on an airplane, okay? And you've got an empty seat beside you, and someone's coming down the aisle, and it's a spare seat. No one's sitting there right now. And granted, today we have assigned seats and everything else, but if it's a spare seat, how many of you hoping, don't sit beside me, don't sit beside me, don't sit beside me, don't sit beside me kind of thing? You want your space, kind of thing. And so where are we at with respect to seeing other people's needs? And I think one of the critical parts in terms of how we do our work is, are we seeing people as people in the whole process of doing work? I think when we get caught up in terms of our careers, when we get caught up in terms of our goals, our individual goals and objectives, we get lost in this being in the box, and we forget what the authors could describe as being out of the box and seeing people as people.
And so would you, like, I mean, I think that's really quite profound, actually, Randy, when you sit and listen to you talk about that, because there's, like, it strikes me that I find it very, very easy to see society do that. So you see a particular, type of career choice or a particular type of company, and we talk about people in very expendable ways sometimes. But it's very easy to not really think about that yourself, in terms of actually, well, where am I? When am I doing this? When have I pretended to be asleep because I got church tomorrow and I'm teaching a sermon and this sort of thing. I remember somebody saying to me a while back that they used to take so they would be interviewing for a job, right? And so this guy would be trying to figure out who to employ. And one of the things this guy used to do is he used to take people out to this restaurant that he knew of near his church, and the service was atrocious. It was like really terrible service. And so he purposefully took this potential hire to this terrible restaurant to see how they would treat the people that he knew the service is terrible at this restaurant, right? And because that's what he was looking for. He wanted to see, how will somebody treat someone that they have no relationship with, they may never see again, which and his philosophy was, that'll tell you quite a lot about a person in terms of how they treat somebody that they don't feel they have any need to be nice to, and if they treat them terribly, that actually, so that's a really, I mean, for me, that's a really helpful, that sort of treating people as people, not as objects. That's quite a challenge for the workplace, actually, because we see increasing, at least I think, I'm not the expert here, we see increasing decisions that are made that are probably not thinking of people as actual people, but as sort of objects. And in terms of, like, even the digitization of the workplace, where we're making decisions based on people's lives and livelihood, based on whether this piece of software can actually do the job better than this person can, and things like that. And so, do you think that do you think this is an increasing problem for us, or do you think this has always been a problem that we do this?
I think it's always been a problem, period. I mean, I think it's part of who we are. It's part of, in some ways, I think, God's call upon us to really seek Him as opposed to ourselves, basically. I mean, I think we have the opportunity, though. I mean, I think regardless of the past, I think we have the opportunity to do things differently. It's really fascinating to listen to my students when they hear this principle, and they go, "Oh, I've been treating my brother that way. I've been treating my mother that way. I've been treating my dad that way. My sister that way," and we then pursue this further in the fourth year class, and we ask them further. And again, my goal here is, as these are business students, okay, I don't have the behavioral science students, I don't have the ministry students, I don't have the biology, I have the business students, and they're very set on their on career, and they've chosen business because they want a job and everything else. And so for me, it's almost like pulling back the reins a little bit, saying, whoa, kind of thing, and saying, hey, who are you, in essence, there? And that all goes back to vocation. Who are you? Who do you want to be? Regardless of the jobs that you'll be pursuing, the careers that you'll be engaging in over the course of your lifetime, who are you? Yeah. And I want to make sure, though, that our students understand that. And it's hard because not all of them, they're all at different points in time in terms of their faith journey. I mean, some have been here, attending here at Westside. Others, may come from a different faith backgrounds. I have some students who are Hindus and some who are Muslims. But my point, essentially, though, is what can I convey to them? What can I pass on to them about being better citizens, being better contributors to society overall?
It reminds me, actually, that there's that story, I've taught on it at Westside before, but in Mark's Gospel, there's the famous story where Jesus is asked to go and heal the daughter of Jairus, who's a synagogue leader in the town, and it's a very prominent person, and he is on his way to meet this daughter and encounters this lady who has no money left, and she's in all sorts of discomfort, and Jesus stops, heals her, and you know the story, right? So, but there's always this beautiful point in Mark's Gospel where Mark, just at the very, and he holds it to the very end, where he just points out that this woman had been sick for 12 years, and this little girl was 12 years old, and you get this sense that it's almost Jesus' way of going, well, they're all people, and actually, I'm not going, well, this guy can help me get ahead, because if I can get a synagogue leader on side, that'll do that. You see this humanization from Jesus rather than objectification almost in that sort of sense. I mean, do you have anything? I mean, it's fascinating to listen to what Randy's saying there. What's your thoughts on that?
So should we find purpose in our job? And I think the answer to that question is yes. I think that's our calling. Actually, I think we're called to find purpose in the mundane. I believe that we're called to find purpose in the tough areas where we're working in. And actually, that Colossians is on my invoice. Right. So I send that out on my invoice, and I've only had one person ask me what it means. So I don't know what that means, that only one person asked me what it means. But because I find it very profound that we seem to think that we're supposed to get this great, wonderful, I think it's very similar to what you're saying. We go into work wanting to get, instead of going into our jobs wanting to give. And I think when we go into our work with the mindset that we need to be getting something out of it, I think that we are highly disappointed. And so I'm wondering about, again, looking to how Christ worked, because he was the perfect worker working in an imperfect world. And he wasn't worried about climbing a ladder. He wasn't worried about impressing anybody. He wasn't worried about, getting a paycheck, I guess. But he went out, and again, he met needs. And that overall arch of service, providing service and meeting needs, and then doing it again with the gifts and the talents and the things that we know we can do. But then I have to tell you that I have had the pleasure of assessing, because I'm trained in psychometric assessing, and I've had the pleasure of assessing people in a variety of different things, from values to the MBTI. A lot of you have probably encountered the Myers-Briggs, to a variety of different types of assessments. And I have to say, we're all snowflakes, obviously. Like, the fact that God has created us to be so unique and so unbelievably individual is absolutely mind-blowing to me. So I look at that and I think to myself, there is a purpose in every single individual. The puzzle pieces of who that person is brings a uniqueness to a job that only you can do that. Only you can do that job in that way, and no one else will ever be able to do that job in the same way again. It becomes yours the moment that you step into it. And so I don't think that we really understand the magnitude of that we get that job description meets the needs of an organization, but only you can do it in the way that you were designed to do that job. And when you leave that job, it will not be done again in the same way. And so we don't understand the power in that God has given us such great power in the fact that we're so unbelievably unique. And I've traveled around the world, and I remember looking at people in the subway in Japan, and I remember thinking, you are totally look exactly like a guy that I worked in Canada with, and he's Caucasian and you're Japanese. And then you see the movements of the person, and even though he resembles somebody that I worked for in Canada, and then you start to have a conversation with that person, and it's not the same person. Like, none of us are the same. And so there's this weirdness about how we think about our roles and our work, because we don't understand that we're given this job for a period of time, and it's a short period of time. Most of us are going to change our jobs every 3 to 5 years. Those are the stats. So if the stats are that you're changing your job every 3 years, think about this. In 30 years of working, you're going to change your job 10 times.
Sounds tiring.
It does. It sounds exhausting. But if that's the stats, and I would say that, like, for myself, because I'm a contractor, some of my contractors are 3 years in length, some are shorter. You only have a short period of time to impact that workplace with who you are. Short period of time. And then you're going to be gone. And what are people going to say about you? Which it really relates to what you're saying. So what is the legacy that you want to leave behind when you step into a role?
It's interesting as well as you're saying that. It strikes me that that's a place that we see some of the objectification of people as well. You know, so what do you leave behind, right? And then somebody will replace you, right? So somebody will come in and take your job.
And we're replaceable.
And then what's fascinating is that immediately then what everybody, at least in my experience, what everybody does then is tries to decide how you relate to the person that used to have your job, right? So, here's our new professor of business, it's Dr. Poon, and everybody's going, well, how does he relate to that previous guy that we used to have? And some people like you more, and some people like you less, and, and you still, I've been at Westside 3 years, and I still have conversations with people that go, well, the guy that was here before you, like, I really liked some of the stuff, and which is a really polite way of going, don't really like you, But the guy that before, if you were more like him, that would be really great, And it strikes me as that we can be, just listen to what you were saying, Randy, then how you connect that together. But then I do that, if somebody replaces somebody in a job and you think, oh my goodness, I've got to start again working with a new person and they got to figure out how to work with me and I got to figure out how to work with them. And actually in the heart of me, what I'm saying is, I kind of really wish you were like not you, you know what I mean? So the uniqueness has huge opportunity, right? But also we can be quite brutal on people's uniqueness, can't we?
Absolutely. And that's where the Myers-Briggs comes in. Because when we do the Myers-Briggs, we discover that we've got friction. So there's friction. And that's the other side to all this too, is that we don't realize that we're living in a fallen world. Well, that means that we have a fallen workplace. And that means that nothing's going to be perfect. And for some reason, secular society has the idea that, you want to find that perfect fit. And apparently, according to research, that perfect fit, so that job that's going to fit you like a glove, is going to happen potentially 2 times in your lifetime.
Right, okay.
So then that means that the rest of our lifetime, we're doing jobs where the glove's a little bit too big for our hand, or the glove feels a little bit too tight for our hand. And it doesn't quite fit us perfectly. And I think that there's sometimes disappointment with that. And again, if I look to the life of Christ, he wasn't necessarily in the company of the best coworkers.
That's a good call.
Yeah, and so,
they killed him for doing his
and
job
they
as
did,
well.
and they did. How much worse can it get? So the reality is we're sitting here with maybe a loose-fitting glove for part of the time. Plus, we're working with people that drive us crazy, and we would really like to see that guy on the second floor leave. And if he doesn't leave, I'm going to leave before him. We're not working in perfection, and so I think that it's messy and it's hard, and the dynamics of the workplace can be toxic. I just heard that today with an individual that I was coaching, coming out of a toxic environment. But what is really interesting is one person's toxic environment is another person's fast-paced environment.
Yeah.
So again, there's that. Not saying that there wouldn't sometimes be complete collective agreement on the toxic environment, but I find that fascinating.
There can be one person can look at one scenario and go, "This is amazing working here," and another person in the very same scenario is going, "This is a
totally
nightmare."
Different. Yeah, this is an absolute nightmare. I don't know why they don't shut this place down.
And so you said, like, just pushing you on that a little bit, because I remember one of our first conversations, you fascinated me on this subject where you said a lot of the time what you're doing in your kind of coaching is actually saying to people, stop looking for your dream job, right? So I want to push you just to talk a little bit more about that.
I do not like the concept of the dream job. I sort of feel it's a misnomer, and I'm beginning to believe that it's setting us up for disappointment. So it's kind of like, to me, dating and looking for work and dating and working are so similar. And marriage and work is the similarities between them is it's huge. So when people come to me for facilitating, and I'm facilitating in something like work search, they also get basically dating advice because there's so much similarity, and I use it as an analogy. So the dream job is kind of like the soulmate idea. You're expecting, again, perfection. So when you walk into the workplace and you think, oh my goodness, I finally have my dream job, it's in this location and it's for this employer, and people talk like this. And you know, I'm going to be working, you know, on the second floor, and I've got this amazing view, and these are the tasks that I'm going to be doing, and it's going to fit me perfectly. And then there's that one person that you have to work with day in and day out. And they're horrible. And you wish they would go away. But you can't make them leave. And then you've got to decide, okay, well, am I going to leave? Or do I somehow sabotage this so they have to leave? And then I think that's where some of that other stuff comes in, right? Where there's these two people that, okay, suddenly now your dream is ended. And you have to figure out, well, what am I going to do about that? Yeah. So the idea of a dream job, I think, in the secular world is actually setting people up for disappointment instead of, you know, the idea that I look at it that this is possibly going to be a little bit of a messy place to work. I'm not sure what the messiness is going to be, but I'm going to figure it out as I go along and understand that no one in this workplace is going to be perfect. And we're all working towards being better versions of ourselves, but in the meantime, we're going to rub each other the wrong way. And we're not going to get along all the time. And that's why there's conflict resolution workshops that, you know, I come in and teach people about conflict resolution because we need it.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it strikes me that again, you're trying, you know, just holding all these ideas, you know, as we're kind of juggling them all. Again, the problem of tension within the job, you know, and probably everybody that's ever had a job, you know, you get this job, you go, this is I love this new job, and then somewhere around about lunchtime on day one or breakfast on day two, you meet that person, and you realize, oh no, they're here as well. They
followed me from the last job I had.
And
how does that happen?
Yeah, and I always, and you know, my pastoral life, I've occasionally made the joke that if there isn't a really annoying person at your job, you might be the annoying person.
Bingo.
Like, I love everybody at my job. When I talk to them, whenever I turn up at their cubicle, they love me. You know, yeah. But again, it comes back to this question of objectification. You know, why is this person so annoying, and what's going on with this particular person? And often it comes back to, well, why is this impinging on me, this particular nuisance? And so I think this is a really fascinating sort of process. And even so I have some friends who packed up their work, and you know, they'd managed to make themselves some money through some investments, and they packed up doing all their jobs in their early 30s and headed to a different country to work as missionaries. And so and this was going to be the dream, right? Because like, we're not now having to earn, right? So that's a real pressure. So we'll move that to one side. And they had a nightmarish year because they discovered even when you weren't pursuing money and were just trying to do what Jesus had called you to, you know what? The annoying people were there as well. Yeah. And so the sense of this is a bigger, sort of broader subject than just simply where you're earning your money. Your sense of even your calling. So, you know, the text from Colossians, you know, here's Paul. Here's a guy that knows his calling, right? But he's writing Colossians from prison, you know. So something's gone really wonky in this sort of journey that he's had there. Do you want to say something on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the challenges of being in the box is that even though we know that it's not a very good state to be in, it's very comfortable, because when we have when we're focusing on our own objectives and our own ideals and our own needs, it's just easy. And then when somebody else basically does the same thing, okay, so you're in the box, you're kind of focusing on your own needs and objectives, and the other person, whether it be a colleague, whether it be a friend, a family member, and they're acting the same way. They're focusing on their own needs and objectives. And what the authors refer to that is collusion. Because what they're doing actually is that they're giving you a reason to justify acting the way you act.
Right, okay.
So if you're basically not being very nice to me, I can, and again, not really being mean, but just being kind of more self-focused.
Yeah.
If you're self-focused, I can be self-focused, and we're happy together.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the challenges there, is that I think that we have to break out of that in-the-box collusion, because there's this notion of being self-justifying our behaviors. You basically, by you acting the way you act, you justify the way that I act. And so we're basically justifying each other in the end.
Yeah. But this is a remarkable human psychological ability to deceive ourselves to the extent that we don't realize we're deceiving ourselves. You know, so I can definitely see that you are not thinking about me and the decisions that you're making, but I'm remarkably protective of my own ability to see that I'm doing exactly the same thing to you. And you know, and you see this in a lot of this sort of. There's a book I read just recently talking about human self-deception, and so they were talking about the classic example: if you ask someone, "Are you sexist?" or "Are you racist?" Everybody always says no, because I've been able to sort of insulate myself in such a way, and they actually would pass a lie detector test on that particular subject because they genuinely really believe that no, I'm not racist,
It's a blind spot.
Yeah, and that's what it. So it's really interesting how we can insulate ourselves and protect ourselves from that. So pushing that conversation on, then one of the things I talked about during this series, which I found quite interesting to think about, was so David Zahl, who I mentioned from time to time, talked to in his sort of work about how work, career, job has become almost religious to us, the way that we think about it.
Yeah.
Not that we think it's God, but that actually, if you observe the way that we go about this, we do it with almost a religious sort of devotion. And one of the things he said then is that our work becomes synonymous with who we are. And this becomes perhaps why we protect it so much, why we insulate it, why we like our box, because actually the boundaries of our working life almost take up our whole life. So hence why we go back to what we said at the start. Our opening question to someone is, what do you do?
What do you do?
Because this is who you are. So I almost want to say, how do we find, and again, I'm wanting to keep saying that when we're talking about work or vocation or calling, like I'm kind of keeping a loose definition in my head of it being that you might not be earning money from this. This might, but how do we, and in one sense, this would be like, I've known missionaries that have struggled with this, pastors that have struggled with this. How do we find the purpose, and this could be a really unfair question, but how do we find the purpose for our lives without it becoming who we are, right? So to me, this is a really important theological question in some sense. So God, like I talked about this, and I think it was part 3 of this series, I fundamentally believe that God made us to work, to do something, but yet he never puts all of our identity in that something. What you seem to see in the Bible is our identity is always that we're loved by God. But I seem to struggle, and I speak to other people that struggle with that this sense of what I do starts to take over, and it can become hugely unhealthy. So what are your observations on that, or do you even have a sort of theory as to how do you stop that question, what do you do, becoming the most important question?
I do have, I think, a thought or two on that. And again, I go back to Christ. If you look at Christ, he didn't have one job description. He had multiple job descriptions. So we see him as counselor, we see him as pastor, we see him as healer. He had multiple roles that he was organically doing throughout his time on earth. And again, when I see him as the perfect worker in an imperfect world, I kind of imagine that he was just injecting his purpose in sort of everything that he did. And again, his purpose was to come here and meet needs and then teach us about our Maker, about our God. So again, we have overcomplicated things in our culture in terms of our work is our identity, and
see, so like pastorally, why I think this is important, if you don't mind me jumping in, is that you watch, and I've only been in Calgary 3 years. I talk to people and hear stories, but then I look at present economy. Pastorally, this question is important to me because when economies do this,
Yes.
people start losing jobs, right? And when jobs are tied to identity, and career is tied to identity, and all of a sudden you have that horrendous meeting with your boss one day who says, I'm sorry, there's not enough money, the psychological and impact and spiritual impact on that person is much bigger than, so like I'd put it this way, and a few people gave me a little bit of kickback on this after my first sermon in this particular series, that, you know, well, if you lose a job, the money thing's a big issue, right? Which 100%
Absolutely,
is.
yeah.
But fascinatingly to me as a pastor, in my 15 years of pastoring, whenever I've sat down with someone who's lost their job, and this is purely my notional experience, but it's interesting to note how they never talk about the money. Right? So I have had a couple of conversations with people where they're going, if I don't get a job soon, I mean, a couple of issues that I've got to deal with. But the reason they're sat with their pastor isn't, I'm not sure how I'm going to pay the bills. It's, I don't know what I'm doing anymore, and I don't know.
It's identity.
That actually you realize, oh goodness, we're talking about purpose and identity. Does that make sense?
Yes.
It goes back to that whole idea of what we talked about earlier on about vocation, about calling, and what's your identity, where's it coming from overall? And I think if we allow ourselves to be able to define it through a variety of vehicles, for a variety of means, not just our work, but also our rest and our play, our relationships, then I think when those situations happen, we're better off. And I think too, I mean, you think of all the negative things, whether it's that, that person on the second floor that you don't like working with, whether it may be, somebody else that's a situation that's irritating you, or even perhaps even job loss. All those challenges, I think, really work to have us really ask that question of, am I using work as my means of self-identification? Or is it broader than that? Can I really see myself as being a beloved child of the King, in essence, regardless of my situation?
Yeah.
And I think we have to keep that balance, regardless of whether it's a good economy or whether it's a bad economy. And I think what we need to do is we need to encourage one another on that whole venue. Because sometimes we can it's almost like that collusion thing that I mentioned earlier, in the sense that we also have to be, maybe in our conversations with one another, it's not, hey, what do you do? It's asking other questions instead. It's making it less work focused.
Yeah. And I would agree. I'm finding that identity and status tend to go hand in hand in some cases, and so the idea of climbing the ladder has been problematic in terms of this particular recession, because as we see folks lose their jobs, they're losing the ladder. So the ladder is in a sense been ripped out from underneath people's feet, and they've climbed it for such a long period of time, and they've wrapped a lot of their identity around this climb, that now it's kind of, what do I do? I have no ladder. And in some cases, they can't find a job. And our economy is not supporting that particular role anymore in terms of people being able to just hop in again, just like 2006 was completely different. So this is challenging. This is seriously a challenging time that we're in. What I'm noticing on the front lines, because I've been working on the front lines of this for 5 years, and I have to tell you, it has not been easy. I would say that people have been challenged in the last 5 years in ways that they have never been challenged before. So they've had to make some hard decisions to, keep the job title, but move to another town or even in some cases another country, and leave the family behind in the meantime. Folks that have been, okay, well, what do I do? Because if I'm out of my industry for more than 5 years, and these are true things. These are real situations. If I'm out of my industry for 5 years as a geologist, am I going to be able to get back in?
Yeah.
So what do I do? These are real. I used to make X amount of money, and now you're telling me that I'm going to have to take a hit of X amount of money. I've got this to pay, I've got this to pay, I have this to pay, I have this to pay, I have this to pay. I'm not going to be able to pay these things. And so people are taking a really hard look at identity. They're taking a look at how they spend their money. They're taking a look at how they rested and how they played, because in some cases the play costed a lot of money in the past. And so people are being challenged to really sit down and think about, who am I? Why am I here? And how do I want to spend my time? And they have been stripped of an identity that they've had for, in many cases, 20 years. And now they're 55 years old. These are some of my clients. And they're struggling, and they're wondering, what am I going to do next? And so the answer that I often say is, how fixed is your perspective? I want to know how fixed your perspective is, because if you're going to come in with a really fixed idea of how things have to go, then things are not going to be able to shift.
Yeah.
So being able to open up perspective and being able to shift perspective right now is the key ingredient for folks who are struggling with looking for work. And because when we have wrapped our identity so tightly around our job title for so many years, and not just the job title, but that ladder and that climb, then we have to be able to completely shift perspective and be open to something completely different. And again, if I look at the life of Christ, who had multiple job titles, and is basically teaching us to have multiple job titles and be open to opening, yourself up. Now, this doesn't necessarily answer the simple or the harder questions like, should I go back to school? Should I retrain?
Yeah.
Because these are the things that folks are faced with. So it's not an easy answer. It's something that actually each individual has to really sit down with themselves and their favorite beverage of choice, and hopefully not alcohol. Well, it could be a glass of wine. I'd be okay with that. But just really, they have to. These are hard decisions.
But it strikes me, in terms of this series and the conversation we're having, that there's some really important principle in there. So we have. Like Health Canada, coined this phrase just recently, this role overload, So our whole, one aspect of our life, our job becomes, so there's lots of people, this is what they're describing as, this is what I've got. There's just too much going on in this particular job. But it strikes me that just because your job is safe and secure, some of the things you're talking about there, you might still want to think about some of those things. So there's maybe your job is safe and secure, but what is your rest life looking like, and what is your play life looking like? Are they in short supply? Is there, what access do if you're a family person, what access do your family have to you, or your friends have to you? What is, so there's a lot of people, I think, in Calgary are essentially working 7 days a week. You bring, one of these people from the past we bring forward to today, what we describe as a day off, I sometimes think they'd look at us and go, that's not a day off. You were talking to your boss for an hour in the middle of the day, or you were sending 5 emails, or you were fixing this or that. And so again, notionally from my own experience, I think that there's an opportunity that we get caught into sort of ways of thinking, that we assume that there are immovable objects in our lives that we have to stick with. And sometimes it is, you get sacked, or the economy shifts that forces one of the so-called immovable. So my wife and I move over to Canada. It was a pretty big financial hit for us to move here. We went from a kind of dual income family to a single income family. So, we moved to Calgary, where I don't know if you've noticed, houses are quite expensive over here. And, so all of a sudden, what we were paying to live in a house quadrupled, right? So you kind of go income deficit, and then expenses increase. So you go from driving brand new cars to old cars. You go from going, okay, I'm not sure how a holiday's going to work. All of a sudden, meals out become a luxury rather than a regular occurrence. But in the midst of that shift, over the last 3 years, we've found all of these other things that we're starting to do that you think, do you know what? These are great ideas and things we should have done. And actually, the X, Y, and Z things that we were involved with weren't actually as important as we thought. And so I find myself wondering how often people actually get stuck in a particular way of thinking because they have certain sort of career notions that they think that can't change, So I don't think he'd mind me saying, because a friend of mine came up to me at the end of my sermon on Sunday, and he said, I had a career, right? he said he was in teaching, right? And he was progressing his way up the ladder, right, till he was in senior administration now in this school. And then something happened with his health that he had to take 6 weeks off. And in the process of that 6 weeks off, he says, I found myself saying, what am I even doing? You know, like, this is not what I want to do. This is, I got into this to teach and form young children's lives, and I'm now behind a desk all day long. And there's nothing wrong with being behind a desk all day long, if that's what you're called to.
You, yeah.
And he made a decision out of this period of rest to actually reshape his whole life and go back and do, you know, what he felt he was called to do, which cost him. You know, that was, and I just found it a really inspiring story to go, yeah, actually sometimes we can be the catalyst for the actual, perhaps the decrease in money or the increase in time or whatever it is. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. What I've learned over several years of doing this frontlines work with folks is if we are open, amazing things can happen. And what we think we need is often not what we really need. And if we actually run our numbers, like the real numbers, we would learn that we need a lot less to live on than we actually think. Oftentimes that's the way it is. And like, you're looking at somebody who left Saskatchewan and went to Japan because of a recession. And my husband couldn't find a job. And then when we both graduated out into a recession. So this was like a lot of years ago. So very similar to this situation right now with young people who are graduating in the last 5 years into a recession and are struggling to find their first kick at the can in the job that they're trained for. So that was a huge mindset shift for me. I had one of the best jobs teaching French, core French, in all of Saskatchewan, and that's not a lie. There were not very many jobs like the one that I had, and in order for my husband to be able to work, he was also a teacher. Our best scenario was to leave. So we packed up a 3-bedroom house, and we moved, and I can tell you that the first year was hard. The first year in Japan was extremely difficult because I went from, kind of some status and a really decent job to dancing and doing the hokey pokey for little kids. And so you would see that as being kind of a demotion, possibly, in my profession. And it was part-time, and I had to piecemeal together 3 part-time jobs in a country where I couldn't speak, read, or I don't advise you to ever move to a country where you can't read or speak the language, but I did. And it was hard. It was just even hard to get to work. Every single thing that I did in my day was difficult because I now put myself into a case of illiteracy. But I stayed for 5 years, and we figured it out. And then we came back to Canada, again, started over, and had to reinvent myself and move to Calgary where I knew nobody and start over again. And then I hit another recession, so I think it's me. I think the problem is me. I think I need to leave now. So the idea of, again, fixed perspective is huge. If we would have stayed in the situation that we were in Saskatchewan, it would not have been the worst case scenario. It wouldn't have been the best case scenario possibly, but I'm pretty sure that we would have figured it out. But shifting perspective and moving again and reinventing ourselves and starting over and literally changing identities in a sense because I was not in my own culture, opened up the door to so many learning experiences and things that I never would have had happen to me had I not done that. And then shifting and coming back here because, again, they started hitting a worse recession. I went from a recession into Saskatchewan to a recession in Japan. They ended up with a recession there too, so I left. And then I don't think the economy got better though. And then I came here and hit a recession here. But again, seeing the writing on the wall, knowing that if we stay, things are not going to go well because the recession was worsening in the island that we were on. And so hopped out and came here. So I have followed recessions around the world. And I know that, it's hard, right? It's not easy. But the reality is great things can happen in tough times.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, so that kind of almost leads into a question I wanted to ask you about, Randy. When we're thinking about, we've talked a little bit about some of the things that can happen to you, right? So you lose your job, you're forced to change, your job's too difficult. But I wonder if in terms of the sort of work that you do, I almost had a sort of ethical question. So again, as a pastor, what I sometimes hear from people is, like this particular job that I'm doing, I don't like who I'm becoming at it. So this job is asking things of me that I don't like. This job is making me, whether it's how I am at home or whether it's, who I am at the workplace. So there's almost a question I wondered, because I feel like when particularly someone that works in business, there's always this question of the ethics of it all. From a sort of Christian perspective, how do we navigate that sense of, at some level, an idea of who I am as a Jesus follower at my workplace, while also trying to, live and breathe at my workplace? That might not be a well-phrased question, but you get what I'm sort of scratching at there.
I think it goes back to what Gail mentioned as well, too, was that the whole aspect of every job, even though it might have a description and everything else, in the end, you are the one that's doing that job. You are the one that's uniquely fulfilling that job. And there's no one way to be able to do that. And in that sense, you are defining that job yourself. And I think, and then it goes back to this whole idea of vocation. You have to be consistent. You have to be who you are in that job. It's amazing to see, and I teach corporate social responsibility at Ambrose, and it's amazing to see actually what's actually taking place. Companies are beginning to shift to a much, much greater extent. The whole notion of ethics, the whole notion of paying attention to how you treat your employees, how you treat the environment, how are you dealing with your suppliers is becoming a bigger and bigger issue. One of the things that I teach my students is the fact that one of the largest investment firms in the world, BlackRock Investments, they manage $7 trillion of investments. Not billions, but $7 trillion of investments. And what Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, said essentially this year in January, and he said it last year as well too, to all the companies essentially that he basically invests in, get your act together, in essence. You need to be aligned, you need to be purpose-driven. You need to be valuing your employees. You need to be valuing the environment. You need to be paying attention to your suppliers. A shift is taking place here. And so I think that's encouraging. I mean, maybe it's not everywhere, and we still see unethical practices take place. But I think that shift is occurring, and I think that's all the more reason then for us to be able to to be who we are, to be who God has called us to be in our workplaces, because I think it's going to be more often supported increasingly than not. And the reason why, people like Larry Fink are saying so is that the marketplace is demanding it. We are beginning to demand, for example, that people are paying attention to things like the environment, to things that's like how workers are being paid for and treated in essence. With social media, and you get a bad story about a company. There was a company that just released the reputations today, and I can't remember the name of the firm, but basically Facebook and Google, which have been way up there at the top, have dropped significantly. They're not even I think Google's now at number 88 or something like that. And part of it has to do with things like privacy, things like how they're treating their employees, harassment issues. And in today's social media age, things spread very quickly. And so good practices are actually being honored to a much greater degree, which is encouraging.
And you see those stories of companies that have rumors of having bad employee working context. And it is remarkable, particularly through social media, how movements can start and almost destroy these companies if you're not careful. It strikes me that, sort of jumping then from that, for me, that sense of as a Christian, I've been kind of, again, what I've been wrestling throughout this series is, what does it look like to be a Christian at work? And almost that underlying question of how is my work worship, I think is so like my background growing up, being a Christian at work basically meant you handed out tracts at your workplace, right? That was the only difference between the Christian and the non-Christian, was the Christian would invite you to church from time to time. But then I was really challenged by sort of the work that Timothy Keller has done in New York, for example, where he says, well, what about being good at your job? Like that actually represents Christ really, really well.
does.
You know, but I've been reflecting then further on that. I think actually there's a level of which being good at your job and also being good in your job, it strikes me. So there's if I'm a a shelf stacker, at Sobeys, I should probably be good at stacking these shelves. But also, do I bring a goodness to that company? So then if I'm a managing director, am I good at being a managing director? And am I actually ethical? Am I environmentally conscious? Am I employee focused? Are my investments, like who am I investing in and all these sort of things? Like these two, I'm curious what you think about that, but it strikes me this is actually quite an opportunity as Christians to sort of model a Christ-like way of doing things that may affect your bottom line, but then some of the research you're seeming to be saying
It's actually not affecting. It's actually helping.
Right. Okay.
In other words, you do work well, and it actually helps your bottom line.
Right. Okay. Because
you attract more customers. Customers are driven basically by in many ways the reputations, and so if your reputation goes down as a company, then you're going to attract fewer customers, and also attract fewer good quality employees as well too. So if you do your business well, you have a good reputation, and you treat people well, not only do you attract the right employees and keep them, you also attract customers as well too. So it actually pays.
Yeah. So that's quite a fascinating sort of almost biblical truth working its way out.
It is quite amazing as I look more and more in this field, and I teach and research in this field. It's astounding how we have an opportunity here as Christians and as the church to be able to get engaged in these fields. Westside is a place of people running many businesses. How we run, I imagine many of you are running your businesses well. Let's continue doing so. We can continue to foster a movement in this direction and continue to supporting one another.
Yeah. Do you, I don't want to cut you off.
Well,
you want anything to that?
Yeah, to kind of hop in on that, recently I've been interviewing people who are working outside of the box. Over the last 2 years, I've been interviewing people who are income streamers, so people who do not work traditionally. The purpose for me interviewing these folks is simply because people were having a harder time finding that permanent full-time traditional job over the last 5 years. And so I wanted to give people the idea that you can work. It's called portfolio careerist. So I'm a portfolio careerist. I income stream. My husband and I have been income streamers for over 22 years. So that's how we work. We don't work normally. We don't
So
work.
What do you mean by an income streaming?
Income streamers are people who we figure out how to stream income from a variety of different ventures. It can be anything from you're working 2 part-time jobs instead of 1 full-time job, and the advantage is that you've got your foot in the door of 2 potential companies that you're interested in, so there's strategy involved. In some cases, it's like myself, I'm an independent worker, now more entrepreneurial, so I used to work contract, plus I would maybe have a full-time job. It sounds like a lot, but I used to be a teacher, so I was working a lot. And anyhow, I did that for a few years to kind of give people an idea of how to work differently. And then I recently started interviewing employers, because I've been researching the on-demand workforce, because 40% of Canada's workforce is going to be, it's going to go contingent within the next 6 years. So that means there's going to be more on-demand workers and less full-time permanent positions. So that's employers shrinking their full-time permanent staff and hiring more on-demand, in an on-demand fashion. And so researching that, I was thinking, okay, well, is this actually happening in Calgary? Like, how is this on-demand thing happening? And so I started talking to an engineering consulting company. They're new. They started up in the recession, and they have what's called a flex model work hours, where a lot of their workers were tired of working the long hours. So in addition to being more ethical, having better business practices, we're also seeing a demand in workers where they don't want to work in the same way that they used to work. And so this consulting company has hired consultants, but then they have their operational staff is full-time permanent, but then their other staff, sort of miscellaneous IT people and project managers and whatnot, they state their targeted hours a month, and then the consulting company meets those hours. And so if you say, if you're like what you were talking about with the, two people are working, they're exhausted, they come home, they don't have, any patience or any time or left for their family. These workers don't want to work like that anymore. And so what I'm seeing is this interesting dynamic sort of happening in I think it's happening in Calgary, where people, this recession has been the opportunity for people to do things differently, for people to change the way they do business, for people to change the way they work, and for people to actually ask for something different. And so what happens with their staff, and I recently featured them in a talk that I did in Edmonton. They say, okay, I want 24 hours. The company tries to meet that 24 hours. So if you are someone who wants to just have more free time to go and do your hobbies and work and rest better, you get to work and rest better. If you're someone who wants to spend more time with your family, you state how many hours you want. They're going to try to meet those hours. And so this has been kind of their experiment in how they've started up their business, and it's been running like this for 5 years. I'm trying to convince them to write a book on their business development and their practices, because I find this quite fascinating. Not everybody gets to work like this within the organization, but the folks that do are reporting that they find that their work-life balance is excellent. They've attracted people that thought that they were going to have to stop their careers because they could not envision themselves working in the same way that they were working before, now that they have children. So they're attracting people that thought that they were going to have to quit their job and for the first 5 years and raise their children until they were school age. And so those folks are back in the workplace because they feel that they can actually survive and thrive. So, and we're not just talking survival, like folks who are feeling like they're just surviving, now working. They're feeling like they're thriving. And so I'm going to be following them for the next, little while, and kind of checking to see, how they're doing, and watching them grow their business and see if they'll be able to continue with this model. It's called a flexible staffing model.
That's really that is really quite fascinating in terms of, I do think we sit as a generation at a really interesting point where the whole relationships of life and all of the things that happen are shifting. And I think that's what's so hard for many people, is we do seem to carry ideas that are from previous generations, but might not be as long-term ideas as we might think they are. There's ideas kind of appear 30, 40 years ago that now we assume, that's the way it's always been. But it is interesting, particularly I think with the kind of globalization of the world. I have friends in the UK that they're up in the middle of the night on phone calls to China and conference calls with people at the other side of the world, and their working practices look nothing like what somebody would have done. Well, listen, thank you so much for being with us this evening. I really appreciate your insights and perspectives.
Thanks, David.
And let's just say thanks to Randy and Gail. Thank you so much.